It's full. It's 11. Oh, thank you. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar presentation. We apologize for the delay. We were having a few technical difficulties. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar, please email Brenda Lugo at brenda@nfjca.org. During this presentation, should you have any questions for the presenter, please use the questions link in your toolbar. It's at the top right corner, and your questions will be sent to us. Those questions will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of this presentation. We'd like to thank our sponsor of today's webinar, Verizon Foundation. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to reach so many people with this important training. My name is Alexia Peters, and I will be your host today. I'm the managing attorney for the Family Justice Center Legal Network, which is the direct services provider of the Family Justice Center Alliance. I'd like to thank the FJC Alliance team for their support and help with this webinar training. This webinar is recording along with its accompanying PowerPoint. Within 24 hours, this PowerPoint and webinar will be available via the FJC Alliance website, and you can listen to it at any time, 24 hours a day. I'd like to introduce our presenter for today. Her name is Debby Tucker, and she's the Executive Director for the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence, a position she's held since the organization formed in 1998. In August 1996, Debbie joined Sarah Buell in opening Tucker, Buell & Associates, a consulting firm offering customized consultation and training to end violence against women. In May 1998, Sarah and Debbie co-founded the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence to sponsor conferences and provide customized training and consultation nationwide. Debbie has extensive experience on the national level. She served as co-chair of the U.S. Department of Defense Task Force on Domestic Violence from 2000 to 2003. She served as founding chair of the National Network to End Domestic Violence during its leadership in the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. She is also a member of the Advisory Committee for the State Farm Insurance Initiated Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence and the Board of Advisors for Women'sLaw.org. She received the National Network to End Domestic Violence's Standing in the Light of Justice Award and Marshall's Domestic Violence Peace Prize in recognition of her national leadership. She has also been honored by the National Association of Social Workers. Debbie received the YWCA's Outstanding Achievement Award, and the Texas Council on Family Violence established the Debby D. Tucker Staff Achievement Award, of which she was the first recipient. In addition, the National College of District Attorneys honored her with their Stephen L. Von Riesen Lecturer of Merit Award. It is my pleasure to welcome Debby Tucker today. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with all of you and to celebrate Veterans Day together, taking out some time to think through domestic violence and the military services. We are going to present a lot of information and then hopefully have some conversation down the line. And I'm trying to make the slide move.
It looks like we're not able to give you the controls, so we will advance the slides for you from our end, Debbie. We apologize.
Okay, would you go ahead then to the next slide?
Yes, ma'am.
And that happens a lot in military situations. I've had staff people in the military who've been assigned to handle the slides and don't want you to take it away from them. So it seems apropos. So I just want to let y'all know that there's some history here to the celebration today of Veterans Day, and there may be parades and all kinds of memorial services going on today that you might want to check out in addition to participating in this webinar and thinking about the incredible service people have given to our country, you may want to get out of your offices and go and participate in some of those events. Next slide. Overall, my perspective on this work is that our movement in the effort to end violence against women has several particular things that we need to do. First and foremost, we always need to collaborate with battered women and victims of sexual assault. We need to listen to them and their experiences in order to build organizations that are continually learning and are actually responsive to what they tell us is happening and that they need. I believe strongly in partnership, that we have to create deliberately levels of partnership in our work with others. Sometimes we only need to cooperate to be effective, but sometimes we have to do more. We have to coordinate or actually even collaborate to achieve our objectives. Ultimately, we want to create a society and a world without violence. Next. One of the things that I have always found particularly helpful is to remind people that there is a continuum of conduct that is all violence, but some of it is not criminal, some of it is not chargeable as an offense, but nevertheless creates a tremendous impact on the victim and is part of their overall experience. One of the strengths of the military's response to domestic violence is that they don't only focus on the criminal conduct. They take into account in their examination of individual cases whether, in fact, other kinds of things are going on, such as emotional abuse, that may not be an offense under the UCMJ or the criminal code, but is actually having a bad impact on others in the family. So I just want to offer this way of thinking about it and looking at it that includes emotional abuse and physical abuse on a continuum. And if we go to the next slide, also includes sexual abuse. And can you go to the next slide, darling? There you go. And other kinds of overarching societal kinds of things that impact individuals and their relationships. So this is a good tool, and I just want to mention that all of these individual handouts that are incorporated into the PowerPoint will also be available in 24 hours when you log into the Family Justice Center site. You'll be able to see these distinctly and more clearly. Next slide. So part of what I want to start with is to think about how our considerations of what causes domestic violence has influenced the way in which we respond to it. And for a very long time, in many entities and organizations, the focus was on individual pathology or relationship dysfunction. And then for a period of time, many of us were influenced by assuming that domestic violence was caused by a response to stress or anger. And then later and currently, many of us think about domestic violence in the context of a theory of dominance. But part of what we're going to talk about today that influences us in thinking particularly about the military is that individual pathology may in fact be a larger issue. For us, there may be an illness or condition such as PTSD or TBI, traumatic brain injury, that is influencing that individual person in such a way that they are acting out in a way that is not consistent with their personal values and so forth. So while this individual problem was the preferred way of thinking for way too long, we now have to re-examine that and consider, in the military context particularly, are there treatments necessary to deal with PTSD or TBI in order to stop the violence? Next slide. Relationship dysfunction was very, very popular for a long time. It takes two to tango, that people were somehow coming together and that either one of them were instigating or could stop the violence. And this was a way of seeing both parties as responsible for it. And for a long time, couples counseling was the preferred response, that if we just do marital counseling, somehow we'll be able to stop the violence. In most places, this has been set aside, and marital kinds of counseling is only offered way after the violence has been stopped, and it's possible to really encourage people to deepen their communication and their relationship. Next slide. For a long time, too, we all ascribe to the learned response to anger and stress. The cycle of violence theory was quite popular. Many of us taught it throughout our communities. We had fabulous posters that showed the tension-building stage, the explosion of a violent act, followed by a honeymoon phase or a respite period. And while this was very popular and anger management was considered the way to deal with the cycle of violence, what we began to experience, and particularly we're indebted to Ellen Pence and people in Duluth who listened very carefully to victims, we began to learn that this did not, in fact, describe well their actual lived experience. Next slide. Out of listening to victims was developed an understanding of the theory of dominance, that there is, in many cases where domestic violence is perpetrated, a desire to have control and power over another person using a variety of tactics, including physical and sexual violence. But it is not based on a mental health condition, but rather something that comes from a larger societal understanding of roles and responsibilities within relationships. The way in which we have worked in our movement to counter the use of this dominance and power and control is to try to balance out the power and to re-educate and sanction those who persist in using violence against others. Next slide. So, one of the things I'm reminded of when this slide comes up is that it is possible for all of you to send questions on your toolbar. There's a question feature, and you can begin to communicate with Brenda and Alexia anything that you would like further clarification on. Next slide. So out of the power and control or theory of dominance approach. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the power and control wheel, but I also want you to know that in conjunction with the examination internally of the definitions of domestic violence and domestic abuse within the military context, in a few minutes you're going to see a military version of this power and control wheel. Next slide. When DOD adopted a definition, it ended up deciding that there needed to be two levels, one called domestic abuse and another called domestic violence. So the emphasis of one is for use in their intervention programs, and the other is for anything that is going to be prosecuted potentially under the UCMJ as an offense. Next slide. So domestic abuse, as a definition used in the intervention program, actually incorporates domestic violence, anything that is a criminal offense, but it also articulates the pattern of behavior that we see that results in emotional, psychological, economic, or other kinds of interference with personal liberty. So again, this permits and is part of the examination of every domestic violence case in the military community, that broader view, not just what's a crime, next slide, although anything that is a crime is definitely included in their examination. Next slide. So in addition, the definition includes the violation of any order set out for the protection of one person from another. And so it's clear that if a protective order is issued, that comes under the rubric of the definition that the military uses. Next slide. So this leads to the military power and control wheel, and I am having a little trouble myself seeing it on the screen, and so you may want to, in 24 hours, check, and if you don't have a copy of this, see about printing one out from the Family Justice Center Alliance posting of this webinar, because it does provide an understanding of the military context that can also influence how these different tactics look within a military family. Next slide. So, in addition to that overarching consideration of what causes domestic violence, we also need to think about what the intent is. How is it that the person is using the violence? What do they hope to achieve? And so these are 5 ways in which we can think about the intent. The one we're most familiar with, of course, is battering, that there's an intent to control the other party. Resistive violence, which we all need to spend more time understanding, it is committed to stop the violence. Situational may be one aberration or circumstance in which a person uses violence, but it's not an ongoing part of their conduct. Pathological is something that we'll spend more time on. And then the antisocial violence are people who are violent not only in private, but to others in the public realm. Next slide. So this is the one that we're most familiar with, and underlying it is a belief in entitlement, that because I am the stronger and more, head of the household kind of person, I am entitled to expect certain things from you. Our response to that has been a social movement to increase understanding and awareness that violence does happen in this context of battering, and that the desire for power and control is the problem. Next slide. What we see here is, and I'm sure many of you have encountered this within your communities, is that from time to time, victims will use force against a batterer, and in the way in which they might approach that, it might not qualify legally as self-defense. Another phenomenon we have seen here is that victims will readily admit what they've done, whereas the batterer may not acknowledge fully the conduct that was going on prior and make it seem that the victim is the one who is actually the aggressor. Next slide. So, what is hard about situational violence is to determine if the pattern is invisible somehow, because battering can look like just one situation if we don't look deeply enough. But there are many examples of individuals who are not acting out of a system of wanting power and control or dominance over the other party, but have engaged in violent conduct. One quick example, I was part of a case review committee meeting at Fort Campbell, where we were looking at a situation where a soldier returned from Iraq and discovered that his partner had over 400 pairs of shoes that she had bought that were all throughout the house. Most of them had never been taken out of the box, had never been worn, but were there. And that explained to him why there was no money in the bank. And he began to shake her and holler at her and grab these shoes and throw them on the front lawn and holler and storm around. And so consequently, of course, neighbors called and military police arrived. And as he was talking to them about what had happened, he began to calm down and to recognize there must be something seriously wrong with his wife, that she had bought all these shoes that she hadn't even worn, and he quickly became concerned for her and her mental health and her emotional health. And so we're sitting in this meeting with all of these professionals in the case review committee trying to think about what is this. And when I suggested that it might be just situational violence, that it's not an ongoing pattern, but a circumstance in which the individual reacted and used some violent conduct, that was very, very helpful for everyone to think about. Next slide. Pathological violence, however, is something that, again, in this military context, is important for us to think about. Is this person who's using the violence, do they have a real mental health diagnosis? Are they abusing alcohol and drugs? Did they experience a brain injury? Or do they have PTSD? The complication here is that it's possible for somebody to be experiencing a pathological condition and also ascribe to the power and control belief system about their relationship. But we've got to think about separating all of this out and being very careful to intervene appropriately. Next slide. So one of the things that we all underestimated, I think, years ago is how many people actually ascribe to antisocial kinds of violence. They are violent everywhere that they go in their relationship, as well as in public and with other friends and family. This is a condition that is not exactly or isn't gender-based, but may be related to childhood abuse, neglect, and the experience of chaos early on. Next slide. This kind of violence does not seem to be affected by participation in battering intervention programs. And Ed Gondoff, who many of you will recognize as a contributing researcher in battering intervention, has stated that he believes that as many as 25% of those ordered to battering intervention programs may in fact be antisocial, violent, and will not be able to be helped by the programs that we have. Next slide. So why is all of this important? Why do we need to think about this big picture? We have to separate out what is going on in different circumstances and different acts of violence. We have to think about what is the appropriate response. We don't want to treat everybody as a peg that we shove into the round hole of a program. We need to think about, and this is also one of the strengths, I think, of the military system, is examining in depth what's going on in one situation and trying to design a response. Next slide. So when we think about pathological violence in the military context, of course, right now, for active duty and for veterans, the signature kinds of injuries that people are coming home with that they have experienced as a result of this kind of war is PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Next slide. So what is PTSD exactly? Many of you have thought about PTSD from a standpoint of victims that you've worked with, that you've seen, who are experiencing PTSD because their life was in danger and they had no control over what was going to happen next. So battered women and those serving in the military in combat have a great deal in common because their lives are in danger and they really have, in many situations, no control. And it's important to recognize that what we know at this point is almost anyone can develop PTSD after a life-threatening event. Next. It can be any of these kinds of things, and even something natural, like a disaster involving a fire or a tornado or a hurricane or any of those kinds of things can lead to classic stress disorder that we call PTSD. Next slide. So here's some of the things that we do know about who may or may not develop PTSD as a result of an experience, but there are a lot more research going on right now to try to figure out what leads to those who have similar experiences reacting with PTSD or those who do not. Next slide. So what do we look for? These are the kinds of things that we do know right now are associated with having PTSD and can influence the individual's day-to-day conduct and experience of life. So I'm not going to belabor this in the interest of time, but I want to remind you that you'll be able to pull down these slides and look at them again and talk with one another and think about what are we seeing in victims, what are we seeing in offenders, particularly those with a military background that might lead to a belief that they have PTSD. Next slide. So what is TBI? Traumatic brain injury occurs if the head is hit or violently shaken. So what we're seeing is that many people are coming back from combat experiences where explosions and, you know, the devices that are being used are causing this shaking and closed head injury. Recently, an order was given that if anybody had experienced been next to a explosive device at the time that it went off, that they would be excused from duty and not go back out again for at least 24 hours to give a chance to see if there was any consequence from their exposure. Next slide. So what do we see happens with brain injury? These are the symptoms that people are experiencing many times as a result of a brain injury. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so here what we have to think about is no matter what the source of the conduct might be, no matter what the intent might be, we have got to figure out how to make sure that we hold the offender accountable and that the victims are protected. So those accountability strategies have to think through what the source is and how to intervene appropriately. In other words, taking somebody who is actively suffering from traumatic brain injury, who has not been treated for that condition, does not understand exactly what all is going on with themselves at that moment, is not likely to be helped by plopping them down into a 24-week battering intervention program when that's not the source of the conduct. Next slide. So the batterer should not escape consequences, but at the same time, we need to make sure the intervention fits the offense. And it is not necessary, if our goal is to stop the violence, then it does not have to be that we punish severely each and every single act, but instead we look holistically, how can we make sure to stop the violence? Next slide. So here's some questions to think about. You know, in what way can we determine if this conduct is new? Has there been incidents of violence directed to non-family members? What other kinds of things require attention, such as the alcohol or drug abuse kinds of things that are fuzzing up the person's thinking and capacity for examining their behavior? Are there other, is there evidence that the offender is avoiding situations that remind him of original trauma that was experienced? And, you know, it could be that if it is battering, that other power and control tactics are more pronounced and visible. So it all comes back to thinking much more holistically and carefully about what we know and what we need to know before we make a determination how to go forward and offer a way to ameliorate the situation and to assist the victim and the batterer. Next slide. So when we think about what our principles are in intervention, you know, ultimately what we're always wanting is victim safety and well-being, appropriate offender accountability, and we also want to change the climate that allows for tolerance to violence in our communities. So if we think about that holistically again and consider the victim of domestic violence who is to whom we are trying to respond, we need to recognize that there's a lot of different systems and organizations that can get involved. And these next few slides from Praxis International articulate it as well as I've ever seen. Next slide. When we have a domestic violence incident resulting in an arrest, there's going to be all of these steps that are considered and processed through. Next slide. If there's a report made to child protection, all of these things and steps will be involved in responding to that allegation and investigation. Next slide. It could be that the housing for the family is affected by this report of domestic violence, and so that's going to also be an issue for some families. Next. The victim might seek an order of protection and go through the proceedings necessary to have that order entered. Next slide. There may be a conflict over custody of children, which can result in a whole particular set of hearings and discussion. Next slide. And when you put that all together, when you think about all the things that victims of domestic violence and our helping systems that have been set up to respond to different aspects, you can see how truly overwhelming that can be for the victim dealing just with a civilian world. But if we add to that that the offender or the victim is also part of the military services, then next slide, you can see that there may be a particular military response as well. And it could come from a variety of ways. The civilian law enforcement agency may have entered into an MOU with military law enforcement to let them know whenever a case involving a military service member has occurred. It could be from a medical clinic, or it could be the victim herself reaches out and asks for assistance. So there's a lot of different ways that the military might become involved and also examine the incident and make a decision about what it is that they are going to do in that particular case. Next slide. But from the victim's perspective, it can feel like, particularly when there's both a military and a civilian response going on, that it's overwhelming and that there's way too much for them to think about. So what do we as advocates need to do in this situation to be better help to victims of domestic violence who are in a military-related family? Next. We always come back to our basic understanding of what advocacy is, what it is that we pledge to do in order to help. Our number one concern is always safety, but we want to assist victims to consider their options and to devise a strategy that they think is right for them at that point, and to assist them in making decisions for themselves, and to consider how justice in this case might be brought about and how they can speak for themselves and their children in any of the processes that we have. Next slide. So this is the advocacy wheel. I figure most of you are real familiar with this, but this is the way in which we philosophically guide ourselves in responding to domestic violence. Next slide. I love this statement from Barbara Hart that clarifies where we're coming from as well as anything I've ever seen. Empowerment advocacy believes that battering is not something that happens to a woman because of her characteristics, her family background, her psychological profile, her family origin, dysfunction, or her unconscious search for a certain type of man. Battering can happen to anyone, I would insert here, male or female, who has the misfortune to become involved with a person who wants power and control enough to be violent to get it. Next slide. So where you stand depends on where you sit. If you are a community-based advocate working in a local shelter, domestic violence program, rape crisis center, you know, sometimes you can be located inside a system-based office, but most of the time you're going to be working in a program out in the community. And there are system-based advocates working in police and sheriff's departments, DA's offices, hospitals, and then also the military. Next slide. Community advocates have these goals and ways in which they see themselves as working with the issues of domestic violence. Next slide. But system advocates have a bit broader system role. They are also thinking about the safety of victims, but as well they're trying to pursue accountability for perpetrators and many times working on just individual cases, but also pulling up and looking big picture for cooperation with all the agencies. Next slide. So the military advocates that we have, and this is one of the things that the Defense Task Force on Domestic Violence pushed for and was really, really pleased to accomplish, is that there be a victim advocate available at every military installation that could assist victims of domestic violence. And there's a meshing of the roles that are often divided up in civilian communities. In other words, military advocates work with individual victims and do the kind of safety planning and other sorts of things, but they also do a lot of system advocacy and social change work through education and advocacy in the larger community of their installation. Next slide. So one of the things that we need to be sort of humble about for those of us who actually work somewhere providing services is that domestic violence victims most often are going to go to informal support networks of friends, family, and neighbors for assistance. And it's many, many times we overestimate how much it is that victims of domestic violence reach out to us. But, you know, we're way down the list of the people that they contact for help. Next slide. I keep trying to push on my mouse to make it go because I forget, Brenda, that I can't do it. Okay, impact of trauma. We know that victims also may experience PTSD. And next slide. I want to caution you that there are 5 things to say to a victim that actually have been demonstrated to have a lot of impact on how they feel and what they choose to do next. And these are they. I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid for the safety of your children. It will only get worse. I am here for you when you are ready for change, and you don't deserve to be abused. And the most powerful of those is the last one. And off of that came the development of 5 things to say to an abuser. I'm afraid you'll really hurt her badly or kill her next time. I'm afraid you'll hurt your children. It will only get worse. I'm here for you when you're ready for change. No one, including you, has the right to abuse or hurt another person. So I offer these up to you to think about as ways in which we can talk to individual victims and offenders in a way that we know will potentially reach them. Next slide. I just love this New Yorker cartoon about how we all wish that there was someone we could go to, kind of a higher power, when we see that Norman won't collaborate and we need to be able to work with him more effectively. So I'm sort of switching gears now, next slide, to talk about coordinating community response involving military and veterans. Next slide. We need to be mindful that the military has its own culture and it has a very specific mission. And that is going to always be on the minds of military service members, what it is that they are charged with doing on behalf of our country. Next slide. The chain of command is an incredible part of how the whole organization works. Rank means increasing responsibility, authority, and respect. And it's a hierarchical structure where access to those higher in the chain of command will be filtered through his or her staff. Next slide. And because of a concept of command need to know, there are no institutional boundaries between one's employer, doctor, judge, social worker, advocate, all of these people that you deal with when you're inside the military have access to information about an individual's life because it might affect their mission readiness. Only the strong survive is another important belief system here, that deficiencies must be corrected or eliminated. Someone is to blame or responsible for any deficiency, and failure is not an option. Next. So because directives and regulations are so very important, and command prerogative is influenced by those regulations, but also completely open in some respects, that command can make choices, it was very important for the Deputy Secretary of Defense to issue the statement that domestic violence will not be tolerated in the Department of Defense. Next slide. So this community accountability wheel, again, something I hope that all of you are quite familiar with, sort of lays out a way of thinking about how to marshal the resources and influence of the entire community to reach that batterer and turn that person around to help them stop using violence. Next slide. And this is a depiction of a military way of thinking about the continuum of caring and what goes on at each level of the society or the community in providing resources and responding. So if we think about early assistance, what needs to happen there are aspects of the military community built into this continuum that many of you may have seen when originally published out of the Pennsylvania Coalition, such as the spouses of commanders or the chaplains, people in the military world who can make a difference at each level of early assistance, crisis management, support and problem solving, transitional resources and longer-term needs, and then also community development, the larger response to the whole issue of domestic violence. So what I'd like for you to in particular notice about this is that there are military components that go with each and every one of these things, as well as those that are unique to their community, such as the spouses of commanders, that have a great deal of influence on what can happen in an individual case. And getting to know your counterparts and people in these organizations will be critical to making sure that everybody's on board in working together to respond. And this comes from an effort at Fort Campbell to identify how in Kentucky, in Christian County, and in Montgomery County, Tennessee, because Fort Campbell is huge and straddles over these two states, how these organizations could all work together better. There are examples here. There's San Diego, who's sponsoring this call. There's Jacksonville, Florida. There's other places where in-depth effort to create a civilian and military response to domestic violence in the military context is helping guide us to future development. Next slide. I'd also like to point out that on the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence website, we have devoted a significant portion under the military tab to providing information that might help you in thinking about how you and your community can engage in a more effective prevention and intervention, coordination, collaboration between military and civilian responses to domestic violence. So please check that out and see what's there to help you. Next slide. One of the most incredible things that was developed in the Defense Task Force on Domestic Violence, and everything that we can possibly share from that experience is on our website, but I wanted to highlight this prevention conceptual model because it articulates as well as I've ever seen how it is that prevention works, and it gives us an understanding of the ways in which the military has organized their own intervention and prevention concepts. So if you look down at primary prevention, one of the most important things, as I mentioned earlier, was a major shift of command climate of non-tolerance. That, shifting from the idea that domestic violence is something you just have to expect or it happens all the time, to one in which it was very strongly stated everywhere throughout the military that domestic violence will not be tolerated. And then you can see the other kinds of strategies, new parent support, education and training, other kinds of things that are going on for everyone to try to intervene effectively. Groups at risk, a more secondary prevention strategy is an important part of what goes on. And there's a lot of attention to the things that we know is sometimes associated with the advent of domestic violence, such as pregnancy or child abuse history or substance abuse. So there's an attempt within the military community to think about and design programming that responds to those that we know tend to be at risk. That bright red line is a demarcation between those situations in which we have not observed any violence into one in which there has been some violent conduct. And then you see the programs that respond after that incident has occurred and all the things that are in place to try to make sure that it does not happen again. But ultimately, if we get to a situation where there is serious danger and ongoing kinds of efforts to intervene have not worked, that ultimately it's possible that a person would be disciplined. They might go to prison. They might be separated from the military, and so on. So I think this is a helpful tool to consider. And if you bring up the next slide, you'll see that there are significant resources also available on the web that I want to recommend to you to consider. The Battered Women's Justice Project has devoted a section of their website also to military response issues, and they have a new project working with military concerns, so you'll want to check that out. DAP, our site that I mentioned, the National Council on Juvenile and Family Court Judges, also has some good information for judges around military cases. Mending the Sacred Hoop and Praxis International as well are possibilities for you to find additional information on working to improve military and civilian cooperation and advocacy for change. Next slide. And this is how you can get in touch with us, our phone number and then my email address. So I will turn control back to Brenda and Alexia to see what questions y'all have for me at this point. And thank you so much for hanging with me.
Thank you, Debbie. We have had several questions come in for you. I'm just going to start at the top. Why is there less sympathy for victims of violence from practitioners?
Why is there less sympathy?
Yes, for victims of violence from practitioners.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if I do, what the person is asking is if victims use violence, that the practitioners don't understand it. Is that what you think it's asking?
That was my understanding of the question,
okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that we're very conflicted about self-defense. I know where I live in Texas, it's just plain not ladylike to use violence. And there's a tendency to assume that victims who don't stand up for themselves are the norm. But in reality, the more that we study this and the more we understand, victims do naturally and, reasonably try to stop violence and to resist violence, and that means that they have to use violence sometimes. So I think that everybody wants to be dealing with a victim who has never, ever made a choice to use violence themselves, but we need to get over that and know that that's not human, and that realistically most victims will at some time or another attempt to resist violence with violence.
Thank you. Our next question involves a hypothetical. You have an active duty military service member who comes home due to a DD 214. However, their discharge was due to violent behavior. He comes home and begins abusing his wife. How can we help that family due to when the service member left, there had never been an incident of domestic violence?
Well, if the DD 214 says that they committed violence, then I'm going to have to assume that that meant that while they were in a combat situation, they made inappropriate choices about how they acted, perhaps with civilians and not with combatants. And that has happened a few times over there and is very disturbing when that occurs. Even if somebody has been booted out of the military altogether, veteran organizations tend to be very responsive and helpful and supportive to them and their families. And so my first recommendation would be for the victim to reach out to the nearest veterans organization to them and see what kinds of resources and support might be available to them or to their service member partner going forward.
Okay, next question. One of the most common ideas about domestic violence is that all the children will learn that behavior. This question comes from a survivor of almost 20 years of DV, and she states that her 4 boys act the contrary. They accept everything their wives tell them. Is this a frequent behavior?
I would say that some of our strongest leaders and advocates for change have come from those who grew up with domestic violence, who were able to very consciously make a decision to not incorporate the abuse and power tactics into their relationships with others, and that we owe a great debt to people like her sons and others who are conscious of the influences around them and decide actively not to engage in that same behavior. Those are the people who've helped us advance this effort and to achieve a whole different level of understanding of what actually is going on. So I would say that while many people grew up around violence and adopted some of those beliefs as their own, more people grow up with it and decide not to be violent.
Thank you. Although don't ask, don't tell is still in effect in the military, what recourse would a same-gendered person have in reporting domestic violence or domestic abuse in the military?
Very complicated issue, one in which I last night attempted to respond to somebody who has an active situation like that. Don't ask, don't tell has not been repealed. People are still potentially subject to an action affecting their ongoing ability to serve, although both the President and the Secretary of Defense have indicated strongly that they would like to do away with the policy. It's not gone yet, and there's a possibility at an individual base or post or camp or fort that something could happen adversely affecting a same-sex victim. so what I would suggest is that we recognize that victim advocates, chaplains, and medical personnel have been afforded the ability to talk with victims without making a report to the chain of command. It's called restricted reporting, similar to confidentiality, but not quite the same. But it permits victims to obtain information and advice about their circumstances without a formal process being undertaken. And this might be the best bet for somebody dealing with the same-sex offender who needs advice about what to do.
Thank you. We have another hypothetical. Repeat behavior of what one believes would be an isolated incident escalates to another violent act, such as in the shoe example, may lead to financial abuse. What would be the proper way to assist that family?
It could be, like in the shoe example, it could be, and what did happen was counseling and support for the spouse who was buying the shoes as a result of her great anxiety and isolation that was broken through. But I understand the intent here that if you examine an individual case and decide that it was only a situation and then another violent incident occurs, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board and rejigger and reconsider, is this a situation where violence is an ongoing tactic and we missed it the first time?
Looking at situational violence and pathological violence, can you speak more to how batterers might use these definitions of situational violence and pathological violence to justify their abuse?
Absolutely. I think that all of us know, and certainly law enforcement best of all, that real, quote-unquote, batterers are always going to allege that it was only situational. If she hadn't said this or if she hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have reacted the way I did, and so on and so forth. So it is very, very complicated, and we have to be careful, but we also do not want to get to the place where we dismiss every single time that somebody tells us, that this is an aberration, that it isn't something that's happened before, because it could be true. And so it just means that we have to be more vigilant and more thoughtful and consider every piece of information that we can get to help us intervene effectively.
There's a follow-up to the shoe example. Did you assess in depth for a pattern of coercive control on his part in the relationship?
Yes. In fact, there was a very in-depth review, and neighbors and friends, and of course the victim herself, as well as the offender. There was a very, very open analysis in that particular case. And so one of the things that I think is helpful about it is to just recognize that sometimes an incident is going to occur and not be an ongoing pattern of power and control with lots of other things that have happened, but something truly restricted to one situation.
Okay, on slide 28, there's the inclusion of alcohol and drugs as part of the pathological violence. What are the references for this inclusion, and how is this as opposed to alcohol and drugs being a mere catalyst?
I would say that alcohol and drugs are often alongside of other kinds of conditions, anxiety disorders, other kinds of mental health issues. They are not causative factors at all. There's something that, you know, in other words, you're not going to use violence just because you've been using alcohol, but it is going to give you permission, so to speak, internally to try to say, I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been drinking, and so on and so forth. So I do think we have to be cautious to separate that out and to recognize that it's not a causative factor, but it's something that also has to be addressed and treated in order to get through to that person. If somebody's actively abusing alcohol and sitting in a battering intervention program pretty soused, they're not going to be able to take in all the information that's there for them. And so it probably has to be treated first in order for them to benefit from battering intervention.
Looking at TBI and PTSD, is there a concern that giving too much weight to TBI and PTSD that we remove responsibility, criminal or otherwise, from the violent acts?
Yes, there is that concern, and I think that accountability in those cases has to be, you know, carefully considered in the best way to make sure that the offender gets the message that this use of violence will not be tolerated, and on the other hand, to ameliorate the underlying condition that is leading to an aberrant use of violence is an appropriate intervention. And so all of that is to say that accountability can be many things. It doesn't have to be going to jail or getting kicked out of the military. In fact, one of the things that we were really mindful of is when you look at what we've learned from lethality assessments, that the danger to the victim of an actually lethal incident of violence increases when the offender loses their job. And so our first response to domestic violence in the military context should not be to boot the person out of the service, because that actually increases the danger to the victim and other members of the family. Our first response needs to be, can we reach this person in some way in a combination of strategies that holds them accountable for their behavior, stops the violence, but allows them to recognize what they're doing, to be re-educated into strategies that will stop it in the future, to take responsibility for their conduct, and eventually to be restored to a place where we can trust them to behave appropriately.
There's several questions about battered men. How do we identify servicewomen who abuse their partners and not assume that the male partner is the batterer?
I think that comes up for all of us in the civilian world as well as the military world. There are going to be instances in which the actual aggressor or offender in the case is a female partner. It was not what I wanted when I joined the women's liberation movement and sought equality. I did not want equality in all ways, but part of what's happened as our culture and society has changed is that more women have in fact, adopted the view that they too can use violence and may use violence in certain circumstances. So we have to look for all the same things. And in my personal experience of running a domestic violence program in Austin, Texas, and later at the Texas Council on Family Violence and the hotline, we certainly saw situations where the offender was female and the victim was male. We also, of course, see a lot of same-sex domestic violence too. So anything that you can imagine under the sun, you know, does happen, and we've got to be careful to look at what information we have and to talk very carefully with people to be sure who's doing what to whom and why.
Looking at the male potentially being the battered victim, how do we help battered men in the military?
In the same way that we help female victims, it may be harder for the male victim to come forward, just like it often is in our civilian communities. The bias that many of us have that a man should and could protect himself from violence, you know, does influence people's thinking and make it harder, I think, for victims to know that we will treat them with respect and concern. You know, I do think it happens, and that there are male victims who need our support and who need the same kinds of basic services, even sometimes shelter for themselves and their children, in order to get away from someone who represents a very serious danger to them.
Thank you. There's various questions about military programs for batterers, and it states here that you said that 25% of men cannot be helped through batterers programs or counseling. How can they then be helped? And I believe this was part of the study done with the antisocial violence that this question is referring to.
Yes, exactly. And what I think that Ed and others have concluded as a result of recognizing that some people that we identify as batterers are in fact offenders that are antisocial, and is that we can't help them with traditional battering intervention programs. These are individuals who may not have a conscience, who may not have the ability to see the impact of their conduct on others or to care about it. And it could be that some offenders who truly are antisocial need to be incarcerated. And, you know, as a person who used to be very anti-jail, I have changed my mind and recognized that there are some offenders that we don't yet have the knowledge and skills to reach, and that really all we can do for community safety is to separate them from the rest of us.
Is there any effective program for military batterers?
Absolutely. There are interventions for military batterers that can and do make a huge difference. And another thing that we've learned from the research on battering intervention is that many batterers are most influenced by somebody that they respect and admire, both encouraging and challenging them to change. And that's why you see in a number of communities, I know in Milwaukee, for example, Marshall Murray and other judges met once a week with anybody that they had sentenced to battering intervention to see how they were doing, to ask what they were learning, to push them to recognize that battering intervention is an opportunity to turn their life around and to move forward in a different way. And those kinds of respected leaders is a very, very natural role for command in the military. And we have encouraged that whenever somebody is in battering intervention, that it not be only that they're going to the intervention classes, but that they are also contacted and meeting with their leadership to discuss how they're doing, what they're learning, and to adopt some of that has been shown to have a real impact on the success of someone going through an intervention approach.
I personally work in the San Diego community where there is a significant amount of military presence, and I've seen various military batters be assigned to attend intervention programs, but then upon follow-up with my victims, I'm hearing that they're not actually attending these batter intervention programs, and nobody in the military is following up with this, and then there's reoccurrences. Have you seen this, and do you know if this is being addressed at all by the military?
That's certainly disturbing and inappropriate, and I would suggest that the military victim advocates need to be an ally in figuring out where things are breaking down in the system and where it is that offenders who have been referred into battering intervention are not actually attending. You know, it's an order for them to go. Anytime that you disregard an order, that's a separate offense right there, and one that most military supervisors and managers would be really concerned to hear about. So there must be a communication breakdown where the offender's supervisor does not realize that they're not going when they have been ordered to go.
And is 24 weeks the military standard for batteries intervention?
No, unfortunately not. In some places it's much less, but we have tried to advocate for that and to encourage military-based battering intervention programs to seek certifications within the states where they are. Most of them are 24-hour programs in order to be certified. So that's a strategy that is still ongoing, but I think that what we saw several years ago was way too many of the programs were only 6 weeks, but I think that that has changed in most locales.
In the military, is couples counseling a standard intervention used where there is evidence of domestic violence?
It's not supposed to be anymore. It was very typically the response, but policy and training and guidance has indicated that when there is violence, that couples counseling not be the preferred response, and so it should not be encountered anywhere near as frequently now as it was several years ago.
Looking towards collaboration between the civilian community and the military, how can a legal aid attorney most effectively work with her counterparts, so to speak, within the military to protect and help her clients?
I think the most important thing for anybody in establishing a professional collaboration is to just sit down and talk with people as openly as possible about what their resources and limitations are, and how it could be that working together could advance the capacity of everyone to do their job better. Most of the time, advocating for the establishment of an MOU or a Memorandum of Understanding will be well received. It is now part of the review for a commander of any installation to see if they have MOUs in place between and among law enforcement, prosecutors, the judiciary, medical personnel, counselors and therapists, social workers, and attorneys, to see if the way in which people work together can be better guided. So some of those MOUs from other places could be very helpful as a starting point.
Looking at training, what is the military doing to train or retrain military case managers to counteract their own traditional attitudes about male dominance and hierarchical systems?
Well, I wish that there was an even greater investment in training. I think that given the circumstances that we've been in all of these years, and I would say that we had some foreshadowing of how difficult it was going to be, because the very day that we presented the results of our work of the Defense Task Force on Domestic Violence was the day that the war started in Iraq. And so we knew that the organization, the whole military, was going to be very challenged with that, and we had to accept that the progress that we had hoped to make would be somewhat delayed. So there has been some training offered and encouraged, but I think that there could be a lot more.
There's another question regarding training of SARC officers, and I'm not sure what SARC stands for.
Sexual Assault Response Coordinators.
Okay. And is that unique to the military?
Yes, every military installation has a SARC. Coming out of the Care of Victims of Sexual Assault Task Force that came about a few years after the Defense Task Force on Domestic Violence, there was a requirement put in place that every installation have a SARC, and that person is charged with coordinating efforts to prevent and intervene in sexual violence. And so there is an identified SARC, even in some cases more than one, at some of the larger installations available to assist victims of sexual assault.
Is it true the SARC can ensure confidentiality even though military social workers cannot? And how are the SARC officers trained?
Yes, SARCs also have that same capacity to keep a report restricted, and they are given a lot of training through the SAPRO office, Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, and encouraged to attend and participate in trainings that are offered nearby to wherever they reside. And you know, one of the things that we here at the National Center have tried to do is encourage state coalitions against domestic violence and sexual assault to always invite military-related victim advocates and sexual assault response coordinators to the trainings that they're doing within the states, so that people feel welcome and can access those opportunities as well.
We have one last question before we run out of time. Do military staff at hospitals screen for domestic violence?
Yes, they are encouraged in the protocol, which is up on our website under Defense Task Force Implementation. There is a protocol for healthcare providers that encourages them to screen for domestic violence. And again, because they are one of the people or professions that have the capacity to receive a report and keep it restricted, they're an avenue for information for victims. We wanted to be sure that victims could obtain medical care without putting themselves at risk for a full-blown report. But I just want to add that, like we've seen in many civilian communities where it's possible to make an anonymous report, later on, many times, victims come back with sufficient support and information. They want to make a more public report later. So I think we're going to see that more and more in sexual assault and domestic violence as people have a sense that they can trust us and how we're going to respond. They'll be more willing to make a public report.
As a final thought, do you have any percentages of how much domestic violence occurs in the military?
Well, that is something that has been debated and researched and talked about in great depth over many years. And for a while, there was a mistaken notion, really, that the incidence of domestic violence within the military was far greater than in the civilian world. But slowly over time, with careful examination, what we've seen is that the incidence is not, in fact, much greater than it is in the civilian world. In other words, they tend to go along together. And we do have the most recent available reports on incidences of domestic violence on our website if people would like to take a look at that and see what some of the reports have been.
Could you please repeat your website for those who may wish to visit it and gain more information?
Yes, ma'am. It comes from our name, National Center Domestic Sexual Violence. So it's ncdsv.org. And before we close, I'd just like to thank everybody for participating and also encourage people to email me, dtucker@ncdsv.org, if I can provide any assistance to you at any time.
Thank you, Debbie. And I'd like to thank everybody for your questions and comments today. I would like to remind you all that we have the 2011 International Family Justice Center Conference coming up April 5th through 7th here in sunny San Diego. The website is there if you wish to gather more information. We also have various items for sale. The newest book by Casey Gwynn and Gail Strack, Dream Big. We have a strangulation DVD available with training, and Judy Adams with Gail Strack's book, The Big Girls Club. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's presentation, and I'd like to thank Debbie Tucker for all of your knowledge and information today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye. What'd you do? And put everyone out. And